This is Ian Williams. I'm the president of the Foreign Press Association, and I'm joined with my fellow executive member, Emilie Pons, who has been following Syria and Kurdistan and similar places for some time. And our star, if you'll forgive me saying so, is Dr. Idrees Ahmad, who has been I suppose it's appropriate, culturally appropriate. He's been David and Goliath to some extent with a few others. He's been Horatio on the bridge because he's been standing there holding back hordes of misinformation, conspiracy theorists, and meticulously and forensically picking apart disinformation, particularly about Syria. But I think earlier when we first made contact, it was about Bosnia, where the similar exercise was going on, where the idea was if you throw enough dirt around, it will obscure the reality. And the reality, of course, was lots of dead people caused by a government that was trying to deny it and getting aid from their allies abroad, both governmental and non-governmental. And they're the issues which we want to discuss. Idrees is a professor of journalism at Stirling University, which for those of you who don't know is in Scotland. We should mention that, which might soon be joining the United Nations. Who knows the way things are going. But Idrees, I mean, this has been a crucial issue, and it has been totally perplexing. And one of the things that you've been exploring in more philosophical and academic detail, but the issues which I've been looking at is how is it that, how should we say, our idols as journalists in many ways, people like, well, you mentioned them, John Pilger, Cy Hersh, Bob Fisk, a sort of whole, a pantheon almost of journalists that many of us used to look up to as fearless defenders of the truth, standing against authority. And now we discover that they'll only stand against domestic authority. They won't stand against foreign authority. And this has been mysterious, almost about the psychology. You know, I don't believe that they're actually doing it. Most of them, I don't believe it because they're getting paychecks, because I don't think, I'm not sure that the Syrian regime has that much money to splash around. It has a little, but what is it that makes people believe obvious megalomaniac genocidal governments in defiance of the truth? And we see it over and over again. And it's a big issue for journalists because, you know, Pontius Pilate said, "What is truth?" as he washed his hands, and famously. And ever since then, you know, we've had the spurious, I think you mentioned it in your draft chapters for your forthcoming book, the issue of spurious objectivity, that you sort of go to the concentration camp and you interview a victim, but then you interview the commandant to say, oh, here we are, the two views, that's okay, and we'll leave you to make your mind up. So, you know, we welcome objectivity, but the journalists can disappear from the picture so much that they're invisible, and the truth is invisible with them as well. So do you want to launch into that and tell us about your forthcoming book, which addresses these issues?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Ian, thanks, Emilie, and also Jamie for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and especially with I want to mention that Ian played a big role in shaping my thinking about a lot of these things, because during the Kosovo debate back in the late 90s, so he wrote a really a wonderful piece in which he addressed a lot of this type of denialism, and that was quite clarifying for me. And again, it's cited in my book as well, because it was a really illuminating piece. I think one of the things that has happened is that, as we see with a lot of these very prominent journalists who have a very nice and critical disposition towards the governments at home, and we do, you know, the notion of journalism used to be that it's speaking truth to power and also to serve as a fourth estate. So whenever we see a journalist who has a critical disposition towards the power at home, we assume that they are the tribunes of the people, that they are the ones who are, you know, telling us the truth that others deny. And many of them actually indeed, you know, during the Iraq War, Seymour Hersh did some amazing work. He broke the Abu Ghraib story. Before that, during the Vietnam War, he broke the big My Lai story. And because of that, we had enormous respect for people like that. And now, turns out that that kind of a critical disposition somehow um, evaporates when, as soon as we come into a context where the main perpetrator is not the government at home, because to these people, to journalists of this kind of a cast of mind, it's entirely about confronting the government at home, and then they project the domestic concerns out to whichever conflict they're reporting on. So if the government at home is saying that the Syrian regime is committing mass crimes, so then you feel somehow that your duty is not to investigate those mass crimes, but to find reasons to doubt that, because your primary kind of a concern becomes, how can I undermine the statements of this government, or how can I either create doubt or even cynicism in a lot of times, because sometimes even when the evidence comes out, and when the reason why I call it, um, one of the things that has happened, which when I teach journalism, I mention this to students very often, is that to never lose the distinction between skepticism and cynicism. Skepticism is good for every journalist. I mean, it's an essential quality. But cynicism is when you a priori reject the information that you'll be presented. So we are we have seen increasingly that blurring, that we have seen this blurring in which people erase those distinctions, and what they try to do is that a priori cast doubt on any claim that is, if the government is saying that the Syrian regime has just committed a chemical massacre, so you just come out, your first statement becomes that I don't believe, because this is the same government that lied about Iraq, and that's why should I believe them? And so they use those kinds of precedents instead of actually looking at the evidence, and that becomes a way for them to avoid acknowledging something. And one of the things that I was just discussing with Emily about that you have um, the notion of back in the 50s, it was Leon Festinger, the psychologist. What he did this research on this doomsday cult, and what he found was the people who were invested in some belief, what happens is that when they have these convictions, they have this material investment, reputational investment. So what happens is that when they're confronted with any kind of reality that somehow undercuts that, so then they are presented with the situation. They suffer cognitive dissonance, that the reality does not confirm with what they believe. So they resolve it in one or two ways. One way is that you accept that, well, you are maybe wrong, but that doesn't happen because you have so much invested in it. So most of the time, people then turns towards denial. And we have seen that, the denialism in the cases of, I mean, probably one of the most egregious examples was Robert Fisk, that he used to be somebody I used to admire, and it took me a while to even acknowledge that he's maybe either embellishing or not reporting as things are. So what happened is that in the case of Syria, then evidence started piling up. There was first this big massacre in a place called Daraya, and he came in, he told the story which was completely out of sync with what everybody else was reporting. And here are all the human rights organization, Human Rights Watch had reported, and then the UN was reporting on it, and then witnesses were reporting on it, but somehow Fisk's view was completely different. I'll go in later on into how he did that report, because it's quite telling that sometimes people, when they go determined to, they have a story already, then they go determined to find whatever scraps of evidence they can find to support the pre-existing story. And so I think that that's what happens in a lot of these cases, that they have their reputations invested in their positions, and it becomes for them, it's also kind of an Oedipal politics, that your main concern becomes undermining this government at home that you do not like. But the reason why that concern itself cannot be a justification is because it's not just the British government or the US government that was giving evidence of war crimes in Syria. We have the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry, we have the Human Rights Watch, we have got Amnesty International, and we have got this host of different organizations, independent organizations, all telling a common story, that this is what's happening. The balance of atrocities lies on the side of the regime, that which is responsible for the majority of the civilian deaths. And yet that was not being reflected in some of these dissident reporting. Dissident in relation to the Western government, but not in relation to the Syrian regime.
Emily?
Yeah, I also wanted to, Idris, you were talking to me a little bit about how reporting changed after 2003 when the Iraq war started. So, to your point, could you tell us a little bit more about that and what does that actually tell us about what is credible and what is not credible?
I think there are at least three ways in which reporting is very different than it was in the late 90s or early noughties. Because what happened is that back then, before the critical turning point, I think, was the Iraq War. One was there was a lot of, uh, it's not that it was entirely misreporting because there was a lot of really good journalism and there was a lot of bad journalism, but the bad journalism received a lot of prominence because it aligned with the government position. And so you had front pages of New York Times, which are completely based on, misinformation being fed to them by some very self-interested defectors, and one of them even turned out to be later directly working with the Iranian intelligence. And so the thing was that they had an interest in getting Saddam Hussein removed, and they provided whatever rationalizations were necessary for the U.S. to go to war. Later on, when a lot of this started coming out, so it created a kind of cynicism about the media that everybody keeps citing that thing that, but then they lie to us about the Iraq War. And it is true, most like the prominent reporting lied, but also we know they were lies even at the time because there was also really good reporting happening. But obviously we forget that that happened at the same time as well. And the second thing is we have first that's because of that's the cause of the cynicism. The second thing that's become really the critical difference is that we now have the in the past, if you are a journalist, you're going to Afghanistan or you're going to some war zone, the people there, even the opposition, whether it's rebels or whether even terrorists, they depend on you to tell their story. So you, in some ways, were a protected category that people you would be protected, and because of that, journalists didn't face the same kind of threats that they do now because we have had this big technological change that ISIS doesn't need me to tell their story if I go there, because ISIS can directly get on the internet and tell their own story. Everybody has got the control of their own narrative. So because of that, what happens is that they don't feel that they need to depend on you to tell your story. That they can they can directly broadcast it using the internet, and some of it became so sophisticated. I mean, you will be surprised if you watch some of the ISIS productions that they produce a lot of videos. They're very slickly edited, and really knew how to play that game. And that was one of the big successes of ISIS versus Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda always remained that shadowy organization hiding in caves and all, and ISIS suddenly got itself this massive army because they were really good at PR. The third thing that has happened is that we also have had this turn towards populist politics, mostly right wing, but some places left wing as well. And one of the common features of populist politics is that it kind of creates this dualistic worldview that it's the elites versus the people. And what happens is that even Trump always speaks about, I'm going to drain the swamp, that he's going to argue against or go and clear up Washington. So, and that has an overlap with conspiracism, because that is also the worldview of conspiracism, in which there's a shadowy elite which is plotting in secret, and then there are the people who are who are the targets of it, and also the people who are going to expose these conspiracies. So what has happened is that we have had these overlap of these three things, and because of that, we have got this a situation like currently that when you look at the debates around COVID-19. Just the other day in London, we had this massive anti-lockdown and anti-mask rallies that they've been happening in Germany. They've been happening in other countries, and that also is part of this distrust of authorities. This very populist notion in which the authorities of any kind, especially the knowledge producing universities, are distrusted, journalists are distrusted, politicians are distrusted, and public health authorities are distrusted. So because of that, what happens is that you have this situation in which everybody thinks that because of the internet, they can find their own authorities that validate their existing worldview, that they need never have to encounter a position which is opposed to them. And I think that those are the three things which have really made it more difficult for journalists to cut through this a kind of a will to ignorance, not a will to ignorance because they don't see it as ignorance. It's a will to disbelief. It's will disbelief. You can call it that they are determined not to accept any facts you present to them. And the authorities you present to them, if you say CDC, they will tell you a conspiracy. Isn't Fauci in bed with the Wuhan lab or something? They will have nice conspiracy theories. If you speak about vaccines, isn't that what Bill Gates is doing to implant chips in your head? So all kinds of ways that people resist knowledge. So I think that that's made journalism, one, more difficult, that if you're going to Syria, the Syrian regime doesn't need you either. So what happens is that you either go, and we were talking earlier about some of these, the journalists, the prominent names. I think one good measure of what journalists are doing, are they reporting accurately or not, is how easily they receive visas to report. Fisk had, until his last days, he never had trouble returning to Damascus. But look at all the journalists who even once reported critically, they were shut out. I mean, probably the most prominent example was Marie Colvin. She was denied a visa, and when she tried to sneak in, then she was hunted and targeted and killed. And because the regime did not want anybody to be reporting without the minders present or without the regime controlling where you can go, who you can talk to, and all of that. So I think that that was also a good measure of who was doing good reporting, that how willing the regime was to see you back in its territory.
It says a very good rule of thumb. It strikes me. Do you remember some years ago, after Kosovo and Bosnia, Roy Gutman and others produced, in fact, I helped on it, a book called Crimes of War, which was a sort of how-to primer for, or primer, as they say in America, for how to recognize what is actually a war crime. It gave a sort of, with definition and examples. And I'm wondering whether perhaps it's time for, have you considered producing a handbook for journalists on how to distinguish egregious misinformation and conspiracy theorists?
That is kind of what I'm trying to do with this book. I didn't know about the book that you're mentioning, and that's where I'm very glad that you mentioned it, because I would really love to.
Crimes of War, Roy Gutman.
I'll check that out. And I think that I did write a satirical piece a few years back. It was called An Anti-Imperialist Guide to Inaction in Syria, which was all about not accepting, war crimes, evidence, war crimes, and all the different ways you can do that. And the irony of that was that I wrote it in jest, but then I found over the years the things that I had written in jest being said by actual prominent people.
So I've often found that in my life, that I put down something as an amusing hypothesis and discover it true by the time it's finished.
Yeah. So what happens is that that's precisely what I'm trying to do. Now, one of the things which I have seen is that people, the last chapter that I just finished was about how conspiracism becomes a tool of denial. That conspiracism is not something that we often associate with the crazies, maybe the ones who believe in the microchips and all that. But the thing is that you do have very intelligent people who often promote conspiracy theories. And that's the phenomenon that I wanted to investigate more. And I think it goes back to the same psychological and cognitive motivations that you have got this. Again, you have got this cognitive dissonance. You are presented with a fact which undermines your conviction, and you want some ways you can resist that information. And one way is conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories manufacture uncertainty. We have seen that with the climate debate. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories that were used over the years to create enough doubt so that people feel that somehow this is an unsettled matter, that the debate on this is not settled, and let's not take positions. And that's always the motivation in this, that you are trying to forestall any kind of political action, even if that is just, public opinion, that the public opinion being shared around this thing. And we have seen that in the case of atrocities in Syria. And the reason why that kind of doubt is, one, unjustifiable and then also damaging is, first of all, if you look at, people always keep bringing up the Iraq war. Didn't they say that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction? And didn't they say that it had links to Al-Qaeda? And that's why we shouldn't believe what they're saying now. The problem with that is that back then, the OPCW and the UN, the inspectors teams, they didn't endorse Bush's, the story. And that's why Bush had to actually go, in fact, forget those. Even the US intelligence, CIA didn't endorse Bush's plan. That's why he had to create a separate office at the Pentagon called the OSP, which was tasked with producing intelligence by sifting through things that CIA had rejected and then feeding it to the government as proof that, well, here's what information you need, rationalization. So in the case of Iraq, it's a complete rewriting of Iraq. I wrote a book about Iraq, so I knew how the intelligence was created. And the thing was that the UN didn't endorse it, OPCW didn't endorse it, and the case didn't have any basis in existing or extant intelligence or facts. Syria is very different, is entirely different, because when it comes to any major atrocity, it's almost uniform. All the monitoring agencies, reporters, open source investigators, all that they have concluded, whether it's you take Amnesty International or even neutral organizations, like when sometimes MSF had to validate how many of its hospitals have been bombed from the air. So it's not exactly, MSF is not there charging who's responsible or this and that, but if it's writing very clearly that these 5 hospitals were destroyed in an aerial attack, so it's very clear because there's only one party within Air Force. So we have this uniformly the same conclusion coming from all these different sources: the human rights organizations, independent researchers, even state parties, intelligence agencies, and also open source investigators. So it will have to be a really massive and complex conspiracy, which will explain how all of these different independent bodies came to accept the same reality, if the reality itself is not palatable to you. But people still have tried to do that. And the mechanisms of that are quite interesting, because a lot of the time they use the tropes of conspiracism, that what they do is that they will not come out with a coherent explanation for, no, that didn't happen, this happened, and here's my kind of clear hypothesis. What they try to do instead is that they come out with questions, a whole lot of questions. And that's one of the common tropes of conspiracism, that you don't have a hypothesis, but you try to find anomaly hunting, it's called, that you find some anomalies on the edges, which are inevitable in any big event. And then you try to somehow suggest that because there are some anomalies, or there's some contradictory details on the margins, so that somehow says that, well, everything else that you know is also untrue. And that has been the method throughout, that you are creating, because you know that people do have the capacity for motivated reasoning. When there's unpalatable reality, they always erect a far higher kind of threshold of evidence that they will accept before they're convinced. And so because of that, what happens is that you are just giving them, you're manufacturing for them these reasons why they should not accept this reality. They should maintain their position of either indifference, or this position that somehow, the knowledge that they find unpalatable is not settled.
Before I pass over to Emilie, I was thinking there's almost a sociobiology of journalists here. Is that I remember at the time of the Iraq War, I remember the oil for food conspiracy, the UN and similar things, where journalists were like lemmings. Everybody was saying this, therefore they said it. And it was not good for your career or your mental health to go against the tide. Now, some of us are born again. I was born on a tree limb with the sound of sawing just behind, so it's okay for me. But I realize that not everybody is brought up in the same contrarian milieu. And what we have here is with Syria, it's not the mainstream media so much as there's a sort of subset of media that consider themselves to be left-wing and liberal and radical, who are being dominated by this crowd thinking. And there's some of the organizations you have mentioned, like Mint Press and the others, which you might call it the Chomskyite fringe. So before I pass on to Emilie, perhaps you might want to comment on why they feel the need to stick together, that they think it would be a dereliction of comradely duty to suggest that Chomsky is full of it, for example.
Yeah, I think that's kind of it's particularly Chomsky's example is a really depressing one, because I used to be a big admirer of Chomsky, and I had read almost, well, it's hard to keep up with how many books he writes, but I had read a considerable number of at least 12 or 13 of his books. And what happens is that because he has a reputation, a big reputation, and because he has been right on some critical issues, so because of that, people assume that he's right on everything that is beyond his expertise as well. And the thing is that he has never said no to when he's asked to comment on an issue, whether he knows about it or not. And which is kind of a sad reflection on the state of I remember when I used to live in London, so BBC very often calls you in for, can you come and speak about Syria or come and speak about something else? And I would go and talk. Then they would call someday for something that, can you come and talk about this issue? And that issue is nowhere close to anything that I have any knowledge about or an interest in. And I would just say no. And, because I can't come and pretend that I know something about this issue, but they just wanted somebody with credentials that they see a doctor in front of them.
Time.
So the thing was that I think that a lot of people have not learned to say no, and which is the sad part, that they are very happy to be on TV. And, and I think Chomsky's thing is that he comments on things whether he knows about them or not, and very often that knowledge has been filtered through some of these same sources that we just discussed. Chomsky trusts his own milieu, and which very often leads him to some really awful positions, where you remember them from Bosnia. And in the case of Bosnia, he endorsed like one really, several, but two especially really awful books. I mean, they were not just that morally it was, the argument was poor, but it was just shoddy work. And I think it's only because it came via his, channel of people that he trusts, and he just put an endorsement on it. And I think it has created this whole alternative ecosystem. And you've got these media organizations. He now makes frequent appearances on this disinformation site called Gray Zone News. And through that channel, he has also involved himself in something which is going to end up in him really embarrassing himself, which is that he is currently a part of this campaign to undermine the OPCW. And why? Because in 2018, there was a chemical attack in Duma. Now, you were earlier mentioning that how do we assess war crimes? Now, here's some established facts. That day, there was a chemical attack in Duma. Just before the chemical attack, 20 minutes earlier, 2 helicopters had left the Dumer air base. So there's something called the Syria Sentry, which is this warning system that is a citizen warning system, which just alerts people that helicopters are heading your way so people can take shelter. So it was created a few years back, and it's been quite effective. So they already warned the people. So even now you can go and reference the tweets where it's mentioned that, well, helicopters headed that way. Then 20 minutes later, they are over Duma. And then next thing, a chemical attack happens. And the next thing that happens is that when finally the rescuers arrive, this big canister has fallen through the roof. It's on the top. And the whole open source, the videos and all are still there. You can check it yourself. And what happens is that you already have a picture. Then you have the testimony of the witnesses. Then you have even people who are still in Duma. They have testified that they have lost family, and this is how it happened. And the whole facts of that were clear already from witnesses on the ground, from the physical evidence, and from what even the Russian media broadcasted, because next day Duma was surrendered and they took over. OPCW then spent almost a year, and they kind of came up with the confirmation that yes, indeed, it was chlorine that was used. And one of the things, even though they were not, Russia prevents them from assigning blame, that they can't identify who did it, although now they've got a new mechanism for that. But what happened is the OPCW mentioned one fact which clarified that who had carried it out, or confirmed, because we already knew what had happened, which they said that the trajectory was that how it fell through the roof. And this is on the top of an apartment block. And that only means one thing, because the Air Force is, the sky is controlled by only one party. So the chemical attack happened, the facts of that were very clear. And then immediately Russia started this big campaign against. It was a disinformation campaign. Fisk became part of it. Fisk went and made this complete story that no, people died from dust inhalation, that this was not really a chemical attack. And then next, he was then denounced by two of his own editors. That was quite interesting. The next thing that happened is that Russia then put out 34 mutually contradictory stories. First, the attack didn't happen. Secondly, the attack happened, but it was staged. And it was just a kind of there's actually all 34 of them are still online, that these 34 claims that does the journalist Patrick Hillsman, who has collected all of them, and he has posted all 34 of those contradictory claims online. Next thing that they did is that Russia sent its GRU team to try to hack into the OPCW, and they were arrested by the Dutch, and then they were sent back in The Hague. And then WikiLeaks announced a big prize for anybody who was going to leak information contradicting this, the main story of what has happened. And they found themselves whom they call, quote unquote, a whistleblower. A guy from WikiLeaks, from OPCW, leaked them some information. They started publishing them. And something very interesting happened, and suddenly Chomsky came out and he endorsed this letter, and they even formed this front group called Berlin Group 21, and they published these letters saying that, well, OPCW is hiding facts, they are part of a cover-up, and that this needs to be exposed. Now, the thing was that, first of all, before they had done any of that, the first thing they should have done is just check what available open source information is. But they went ahead with it anyway. But then last week, a very interesting revelation that happened is that then turned out all these information that came out, that the guy, he was an Irish former inspector named Brendan Wellen, who had never visited Duma. And he was the person who turned out who was leaking to WikiLeaks. And the interesting thing that turned out was that before leaking, he had been in communication with the Russian ambassador to The Hague and to the OPCW, this guy called Shulgin. And so he had been liaising with the leaks and everything with him. So it was part of this whole disinformation campaign. But the thing is that the reason why that even became significant is because people were ignoring the fact that there was already physical evidence, there was already journalistic reporting on it, there was already open source information. So even if, let's say, that this person was correct, they would still have to overcome the weight of all this other evidence, which is independent of the OPCW. So that's where the conspiracism comes in, that they are looking for any anomalies, they're looking for any kind of things that they can find on the edges through which they can contradict the main story. Manufacturing doubt is what they are interested in.
Emilie.
Yes, Idrees, I'm very interested in how you describe all these manipulation tactics in your book, and in your book also you explore a lot of topics that have to do with psychology and journalism, psychology and propaganda, and you even talk about Freud. And I thought that was very interesting to explore the processes of propaganda in general and false beliefs. And one of your chapters is even called Resilience of False Beliefs. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've been mixing these two fields, these very different fields, journalism and psychology, brain studies, neuroscience?
Yeah, I think it was that was quite kind of an interesting, it came out of this interesting epiphany. I was reading, there's this NYU psychologist named Gary Marcus. His book is called Kludge, which was about how basically this haphazard evolution of the human brain, that over time how it evolved, and which has left several defects in the human brain, and which predisposes us to instinctual action, that we are very often, we make there's actually another great book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, in which he describes these processes that, the brain has these processes, the immediate, fast, instinctive, that we make judgments and then subsequently we rationalize them. And I think that what happens is that, one of the things that I say in the book is that we are less rational beings than we are rationalizing beings. And I think that that's where ideology and then rationalization becomes really important in the use of propaganda. That what propaganda then does is that there are two levels of propaganda. There's this great French sociologist, Jacques Ellul, who was one of the first great theorists of propaganda. That he spoke about, there's the sociological propaganda and the political propaganda. Sociological propaganda is basically, it includes our socialization, education, and upbringing, that they instill certain ideas in us. Political propaganda is more immediate, but it's our sociology that determines what kind of political propaganda we will accept or will respond to. So what happens very often is the propaganda tries to find um, those cues, and they are very directed. Um, I mean, to give you a recent example of, many of you heard of the big Cambridge Analytica story, that this scandal. And one of the things that they were doing was they were collecting a lot of data from Facebook usage and likes and purchases and all, and they had 50,000 data points on each individuals. So they knew susceptibility of individuals to what kind of messaging. And so they then are counting on those brain processes, that you'll make this instinctual leap because you're already disposed in a certain way. So they are going to message you so that you respond. So one of the key arguments of my book is that we have paid a lot of attention to the supply side of propaganda, that we are trying to understand its mechanisms, but we haven't really paid enough attention to the demand side. Because what happens is that among people, there's already an existing need to believe things. And what propaganda does is satisfies those needs. That if you already are disposed to, for example, disbelieving that the Syrian regime is committing atrocities, so propaganda is going to feed you. They know that, well, this is your need, and it's going to feed you the cues through which your skepticism is reinforced. And I think that that's where understanding of the first, it is the parts of it are the neuroscientific parts, that which is how your brain acts, but the second thing is also that how your cognition acts, how your mind works. And there we have got certain processes. We have got once again, the two probably the most famous ones are, one is confirmation bias, that we look for evidence which confirms our existing beliefs, and the second is motivated reasoning, which is the flip side of it, which is that you always the things that you do not want to believe, you always find ways to rationalize them away, that you erect far higher standards of evidence, and that way you can keep yourself from accepting realities that are not your own. And then there's another interesting thing is that we never think as individuals. We are social beings, and our thinking is very much intertwined with other people's thinking. Very often, I mean, there's a what's there another psychologist, Sloman, he calls this the knowledge illusion, which is that we always have this assumption that we know a lot more than we actually do. I mean, they proved it with various experiments, and that's partly because a lot of our knowledge is distributed around us. That we assume that it's something that we know, but we are often depending on people around us. So what happens is that even sometimes, like let's say that you are committed to believing that no, Assad couldn't have done a chemical weapons attack. What does he have to gain from it? He was winning the war anyway. These are the kind of rationalizations people make. And if you are inclined to believe that, I'm presenting you with several facts, counterfacts. I say that, well, he was doing it because he wants to flush out the population, which you very often would take shelter in underground bunkers, and chemical weapons reach there and flush them out. Secondly, that it was successful, that when he used the chemical weapon in Duma, next day they surrendered. I'm presenting you with facts to counter the point you have made. Except what will happen is that you will not immediately accept everything that I say, because you have many people around you who are convinced that Assad didn't carry out the chemical weapon attack, and you think that, okay, maybe maybe my knowledge is incomplete, but people around me, they also believe this strongly, so there must be a basis for believing this. So because of that, you will resist accepting my counter arguments. So I think that that's where these psychological processes become critical in why false beliefs persist, and why people's their kind of convictions are so resilient.
And part of it is that I think most good journalists are agnostic, in the sense you don't have a prefixed set of beliefs. You're open-minded, you're prepared to consider possibilities, and as Cromwell once implored to Parliament, I beseech ye in the bowels of Christ, consider that ye may be wrong. And most people don't consider that they may be wrong. The good people have doubts all of the time, which unfortunately is it's an open door for a fifth column to get in right away. If you have doubts, and you're talking about, it's the manufacture and exploitation of reasonable doubt that this works on. Well, we all know that US and NATO has been vicious and evil. We all see poor Assange locked up there, immorally and illegally, as far as I'm concerned. But that doesn't mean he's sort of the angel of probity, and that what he says and what WikiLeaks says should be taken as gospel everywhere. But it's very difficult for people to wrap their head around these concepts, it's I think you have to be a bit of a sociopath to do so, almost. That's a confession as much as anything else. But how do you maintain that type of objectivity as a journalist is the key question here, because we are hoping that we were discussing earlier, having a seminar of some kind, a debate even. I've debated Tariq Ali at the New York Socialist Scholars Conference about Kosovo. Noam Chomsky ducked, by the way. We debated him on paper afterwards, but the cut and thrust is there, and it is bemusing to debate somebody who's denying thousands of corpses that were being dug up under the Serb police headquarters in Belgrade, and saying that they were victims of NATO bombing. I mean, this was this suspension of disbelief is quite stunning to confront in the place. But if you're an agnostic, you have your doubts. They are certain. They are always certain with what they say, because lies are easier than the truth, because the truth is messy, but lies are formed perfectly with the rough edges smoothed off in the manufacture.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that, this is, even Hannah Arendt had mentioned this, that one of the things that happens with a lot of people is that they're always looking for, their view of the world is far more coherent than the world actually is. The world has all its contradiction problems and all that in every situation. But what happens is that people generally prefer coherence in their thinking and everything. So what happens is that what generally totalitarian ideologies, but also ideologies generally offer, is a more coherent world, a world that makes sense, and a world that doesn't require you to study each different situation according to its various granular, complicated details, that it just gives you the template that you can apply, that you can lift from one place to another and apply to different places. And that way, it reduces your cognitive labor. And I think that is the problem with a lot of these individuals, that they have certainties because they could take, like, let's say that you have a situation like Iraq, and then you suddenly start applying it to other places which are very different. I mean, for example, take Iraq and Syria. People always make this comparison. Now, think about Iraq was that at the time it was invaded, there was no imminent humanitarian crisis. It would be different if we were debating 1989 or 88, when Saddam Hussein was committing these massacres. My calculation would be different. My view would be different. I opposed the war in 2003 because I didn't see that there's any kind of a imminent situation that requires intervention, and action could create much worse consequences. But 89 or 88, my calculation would have been very different. That, well, here's a massive massacre, and there needs to be consequences for that. That the Kurds of Halabja were, there was a sarin and VX was used over them. So the use of nerve agent, and that's a kind of a horrific way to die. It's sometimes one of the things that happens is that we speak about a lot of these things in very abstract terms. And I myself, my knowledge was rather abstract until I would say there were two books that I read. One is Haruki Murakami's account of the Tokyo underground bombing, and because it has a lot of oral testimonies from the survivors. And the second is Dan Casetta's book, Toxic. And then you realize the death by these nerve agents is a really, probably one of the most horrific ways to die. And here, in one incident, we had 1,400 people who were killed that way. So to get back to this question of certainty and doubt, ideology gives people certainty. And as I say at the beginning of the book, it's never about truth versus falsehood. It's never, the debate is not, when you're debating somebody like Tariq Ali, so he's not presenting falsehoods, he's presenting a political truth that he thinks, he has political truth derived from maybe from different situations, but he has this ideological conviction which is based on a political truth. Like in this case, it would be a political truth would be that the US lied to go to war in Iraq. It's an imperialist power, and that's why whatever it's doing now is also in the similar tradition. Whereas journalists' concern should be empirical truth, that they should be there with an open mind about outcomes, and they should be looking at, well, what does the fact, where do the facts lead? It shouldn't be about that I've got a pre-existing position. I mean, that's very often happens with journalists. And then with somebody like, I was mentioning to Emilie earlier on that my view, for example, Robert Fisk was resilient for a long time because I agreed with him on so many things, on Iraq war, on Israel-Palestine and other things. So because of that, what happened is I did not subject his journalism to the kind of criticism or skepticism that I would have had I seen his other reporting. Like, so I remember I had a discussion with a Reuters reporter who was in Kosovo at the time Robert Fisk went there. And so he was saying that Fisk actually came with a story already in mind, and then he went with us, and then he wrote a story which was completely different than what we had witnessed. And I got into an argument with him. I wasn't present there, but I was so kind of ardent in my defense of Fisk that I didn't accept. I thought, well, Fisk gets attacked so much by people that I don't like that I thought that I assumed that, well, this is another unjustified attack on him. But then came, what's his name? Oh, then came Syria. And then I suddenly realized, I mean, there were some instances which was just so unethical that it just blows your mind. I mean, he actually rode a tank and went to the site of a massacre. There had been a massive massacre in Daraya. And then in the presence of regime soldiers, he's interviewing the survivors. And obviously they are trying to say anything that will prevent them from further consequences. Although even there, it's telling that everybody he quotes doesn't say what he says in the headline or even in his main conclusion. That he then comes out with the story that, well, this wasn't a massacre. This was actually prison swap gone bad, and it was the rebels who killed all these people. Literally nobody was saying that, because so this is the other aspect of something that I wanted. It's Emilie was mentioning earlier on about how journalism has changed. One of the other things is also that, for example, Daraya, this massacre has happened. Daraya also has internet. A lot of people can still get on Skype, or they can use WhatsApp. And so what happened is the people are accessible. So which meant that there were a lot of witnesses to something that had happened. And that's exactly what the UN did. That's exactly what Human Rights Watch did, that they spoke to all these witnesses and they confirmed that, yes, indeed, there had been a massacre. But Fisk comes out with his totally kind of a bogus story without even recognizing that, first of all, he is there with the soldiers, and he doesn't say that, well, maybe that's, taking away people's willingness to tell the truth, because that could have lethal consequences for them.
Emilie.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Idris. I really appreciate what you've been sharing with us, and I also wanted to ask you this question: like, how did you start getting interested in accuracy, utmost accuracy in reporting? Because I think that not all reporters actually think about it. A lot of us just do our work the best we can, but accuracy is not always something that we prioritize necessarily, and it's not always something that we also explore in depth the way you've done with this new book. So I'm actually interested in, when did this start for you? When did that process of thinking about utmost accuracy in reporting start for you? Was it like 5 years ago? Was it 10 years ago? And how and why?
Before you do, Idrees, we've had several questions coming in. Tell us
Okay.
when the book is coming out and what it's called, because I understand both of these are still up in the air.
Yeah, the book was actually, I got hit with COVID, so that delayed it by several months. It should have been actually coming out around this time. So it's going to be hopefully later this year. It's Columbia University Press, which will be publishing it. The book's tentative title is what the title of this talk was, which is Dark Instruments and Misinformation and the War for Truth in Syria. So it will be later this year. And yeah, if you follow me on or any of those, once it starts coming out, I'll announce it once it's ready for publication. Um, and regarding the question that Emilie asked, interestingly, it started with I was actually born in the northwest of Pakistan, and that also then later became the center of the whole drone war. And the drone war became the subject of a lot of controversy because uh, it was kind of it was initiated under George W. Bush, but his use was actually quite limited. Obama really amped up the use of drones in especially in the FATA region, and then a lot of statistics started coming out, which were about how many people were being killed and all. And the reason why that became a subject of concern for me was that a lot of the statistics were based on secondary sources, which was anonymous Pakistani officials and anonymous CIA sources. The problem with that was that Pakistani military officials had an interest in undercounting the civilian casualties because they didn't want, domestic unrest because of that. There was already anger about all of that. And then also what happened is that the CIA had its own reasons for exaggerating its successes, and but there were a lot of reasons why that there was a reason for doubt that who is being killed and how many of them are actually combatants. One of them was because nobody ever visited FATA to verify who was being killed. You know, Pakistani government would never send anyone, and the US obviously didn't send anyone. And it only started to become a question when the US would claim that they have just killed 80 terrorists, and then it would turn out to be, oh, it's you know 60 seminary students in a place called it's one of the in Bajaur agency, and there were many incidents like that started happened where the US made certain claims, and then it would later turn out that there was actually a lot of civilians had been killed. So that became my question at the time, that how much does the CIA actually know about the claims it is making? And some of it then became really interesting because when in one instance, the US ended up killing two Western hostages because they bombed a place, said that these were terrorists, and then later on it turned out that they didn't even know who they were bombing. And then later on, the criteria was released, and which was even more insane. And this was under Obama administration. To its credit, later on, Obama administration took into account the criticism and changed the policy. But the criteria was that any military-aged male in that whole conflict zone was considered a legitimate target for for bombing, and unless they can posthumously prove that they were not terrorists, and which most of us can't once we are dead. So the thing was that the policy was pretty absurd, and it was, in its very kind of conception, it was dangerous. So the number of civilian casualties, then the Bureau of Investigative Journalism started doing very careful analysis of that, producing data on that, that how many civilians were being killed. And even they could only report civilian casualties that could be verified through reporting, and they could also couldn't send people on the ground very often. So their numbers are probably the most accurate, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, because they put a lot of effort into the accuracy. And that was sort of like where it started. Then in Syria, it became almost a necessity, because in Syria, it was the denialism took a very interesting form, that it would not happen incident by incident, because that was very difficult. Most of it was aerial bombing, and there was only one party with an air force. So that was it was very obvious who was doing the bombings, especially there were hospitals being targeted, and um, what's his name, these neighborhoods all the time, refugee camps. What started happening was that when some prominent atrocity would happen, that's when the denialist ideas would suddenly start spreading. And and the thing was also that that's the only time it will come into the notice of some of the people who otherwise were not invested day to day in what's happening in Syria. Like, Noam Chomsky, look up his archive. He doesn't speak about Syria much, except when something big happens. And then he comes out and he already has a set position. And which is kind of also interesting here, because in 2012, Chomsky, before the big chemical attack happened, he actually visited Lebanon, and he met a lot of Syrian civil activists. Although even that meeting was quite interesting, because one of the civil activists said, three of them actually told me the story, that Chomsky was asking them how things are going, and he was fully in solidarity with them, and it was all quite nice. And then asked them what has happened, what's happening in Syria. They were telling him all of that. He says that, but that can't be true. He says that that's not what my friend Patrick Coburn is telling me. And so, which was kind of interesting, because he said, well, here is a whole group of Syrians sitting in front of him telling that this is what's happening to us. But he said, well, but that's not my friend Patrick Coburn is telling me. But still, he was at this time sympathetic to the revolution.
Were you going to believe me or your own lying eyes? That's the favorite quote. Look, we are coming towards the end now, and we have had questions coming in. Those of you who have put in questions, I hope you realize that we've been paraphrasing them and putting them and dealing with them. There are a lot more that would go, which points to our urgent need to convene some type of conference panel. Maybe now that COVID is coming, internationally or even in person, on how we distinguish misinformation and what the sources are of misinformation. How you can get the first litmus test. It doesn't smell true to get through. And so I want to really thank you for coming. This has been a very illuminating discussion, and thought-provoking as well. We have others coming up soon, hopefully equally. We're going to the other side. In the wake of the Human Rights Watch report on Israel, we have an FPA member, Tuvia Tenenbaum, talking about his best-selling ebook, Taming of the Jew, where he toured Europe and tested them for anti-Semitism and found them wanting. You can judge for yourself on May the 4th when we have it. On May the 19th, our member Nina Burley has her best-selling book, Virus, Vaccinations. Well, it's not best-selling. Her previous books have been best-selling. Virus, Vaccinations, the CDC, and the hijacking of America's response to the pandemic. So returning to conspiracy theories. And coming up is going to be June the 16th, when we have my old friend Ban Ki-moon joining to discuss his memoirs, Resolved, Uniting Nations in a Divided World. And of course, the lack of role of the United Nations in Syria is an interesting part of this discussion. So thank you on behalf of Emilie and myself. Emilie, you want to say thank you yourself?
Yes, I'm very happy we had you, Idrees. It was really nice to be able to talk to you here about this book that hopefully, many people will read.
Thank you
So
very much. Thank you.
for those of you out there, we hope you put yourselves on our mailing list. You will come to us with suggestions for panels like the one we've just discussed, and even bigger events, because we really are interested in the craft of journalism, how it's practiced in a critical way. And also, of course, if you can, join the Foreign Press Association. And look, if you can't and you've got a checkbook, we've had no revenue for 2 years. We've been running this as a public service, which is good. That's what we're here for. But we still need money to keep the show on the road. So and any of you who are in a foundation out there with a checkbook to spare, please contact us immediately. And also, we're looking forward to jointly doing events like the disinformation panel and maybe the production of a handbook guide to conspiracists, how to spot a conspiracist or something like that, which Idrees, I hope, will play an active part in. So thank you very much, everybody. We hope to see you soon, next week, May the 4th, for our next one, and May the 19th.
You cannot keep me down. I won't fall to the ground. I'll struggle on for 10 long years. About the other side, crystal clear. I'm made from the same stuff as you. Blood and bone through and through. I don't desire anything at all, and I'm indestructible.